but I'm now trained as a certified holistic nutritionist. And I went back and did that in my 50s after I discovered that lowering oxalate in my diet changed my life. The research says it could be related to arthritis, could be related to breast cancer. So people who might have leaky gut might be more at risk. We're really told regularly to eat spinach, almonds, and other nuts, Swiss chard. There's some research that shows that chaga mushroom could be as high as up to 20,000 milligrams in 100 grams. The best way to know if oxalates is your problem is to lower oxalate and see if something happens. But I was essentially by about 18 months out feeling like a normal me. What we really want is a nutrient-dense diet that's low in toxin. Carnivore absolutely fits that bill.
Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Welcome. Today with us, we have special guest Monique Attinger, who is from, Toronto and has a specialty in holistic nutrition, and I think a focus on oxalates, if I'm not mistaken. So, Monique, why don't you just share a little bit about yourself, and then we can get into the topic du jour.
Sure. Well, my background is actually, interestingly enough, I have an undergrad degree in kind of a hodgepodge of things, but that led me to a master's degree in library and information science. So, lots of interest in researching and reading on my own. So that was very handy when I somehow fell into the oxalate rabbit hole and started to learn about this topic. And there's not really a lot out there. When I started trying to do the diet just for my own family, the big issue was there was only one place to learn, and that was something called the Trying Low Oxalates Yahoo group back in the day. So that research capacity, so I could go into PubMed and find answers, was very helpful. But I'm now trained as a certified holistic nutritionist. And I went back and did that in my 50s after I discovered that lowering oxalate in my diet changed my life. I thought I would not live to see my children grow up, and I'd had them late in life. So I had a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old when I discovered oxalate. And so now I'm in my 60s and I'm probably healthier than I've been for most of my adult life.
So when you first started discussing oxalates, years ago, how long ago was that? What time frame wise?
Well, I started doing it for our family about 17 years ago, 16, 17 years ago. I've been working as a health coach before I became a nutritionist for a decade now. So lots of learning has gone on in that time period.
Okay. Because and you're probably familiar with Sally Norton. I mean, she's been talking about oxalates for a few years now. And I know she's been banging that drum pretty hard for a number of years. And so I've talked about this a few times in the past, but it's been a while. And so I guess for the folks that are unaware of what are oxalates, I mean, what do they do? Why do we have them? What are the concerns around them?
Right. So the big thing with oxalate is that the standard nutritional advice really has us revving them up in our diet. And so the challenge really is that we don't really look for oxalate unless somebody's got kidney stones. And yet there could be other things that oxalate's doing. The research says could be related to arthritis, could be related to breast cancer, which is one of those things I really like to make people aware of. But there's new research just coming out that shows that it could be behind what's happening when you get arterial plaque. So we've got all kinds of places where oxalate can be impacting our health. And so, the challenge really with oxalate is that it's been under the radar. The foods that we're being told are extra healthy also happen to be almost universally high in oxalate. And there's also oxalate, which our body can make. So we can be making a certain amount of oxalate endogenously. And the combination of high oxalate diets plus potentially the kinds of things that we do to treat things like infections, like antibiotics actually can be apparently depleting us of vitamin B6 and then setting us up for more than normal endogenous oxalate production. So we do produce some oxalate naturally out of our metabolism, but what we're doing is essentially revving up how much oxalate our bodies have to deal with to such an extent that we're exceeding our capacity to handle it and get it out of the system.
Why do we have it in the first place? What is it? Everything seems to serve a purpose in the body. Is it an intermediate, or does it have an actual purpose?
It's a metabolic end product. So the challenge really is that it's a metabolic end product, it's toxic, and we have no way to recycle it or use it in any other useful way. So we do know our bodies are designed to be able to deal with oxalate and get it out, but the challenge is really this business of exceeding our capacity.
So, I mean, I may be wrong on this, but I think like something like urea, which is, a metabolic end product of protein metabolism, and it's excreted in the urine and sweat and respiratory. Is it the same thing with oxalates? I mean, primary excretion is GI tract, urine. I mean, how do we supposed to get rid of it?
Very similar. So it's secreted out. So kidneys, digestive tract, but you can actually be moving it out through the skin, and you can move it out through mucous membranes. So some people will actually get, to some degree, lung issues with it because of the fact that we can be getting rid of it out of the respiratory system as well. So basically, any way that you can secrete stuff can potentially be a way you could be moving oxalate. So that's a bit of a challenge for those of us who think they're just kidney stones.
And I would assume there are some people that are more susceptible to oxalate than others. I mean, is that a fair statement or not?
I would say so as well. I'm not sure that we've got a good idea of who people are who would be more at risk. Like, I'm not sure there's a genetic profile, but I can say for sure some combination of you absorb it too easily. So people who might have leaky gut might be more at risk. You don't get it out as efficiently. So somehow you're not secreting it out as well as you should. And then I'm not sure what other kinds of genetics could be involved, but just anecdotally, I see a lot of people in my own practice who have MTHFR, and I'm not sure how that would be related. I just see the pattern.
So, I mean, anything that would impair, I mean, I could imagine somebody with renal disease, they have impaired excretion, so that would probably accumulate. There's probably other similar comorbidities where that shows up. And you said early on our nutritional recommendations tend to steer people to a high oxalate diet. Can you be more specific on that? I mean, I'm sure it's not intentional. There's not like they're saying we need an oxalate requirement, but what foods that we are traditionally told we should be eating in abundance are problematic?
Well, you made mention of Sally Norton. Her book, Toxic Superfoods, kind of speaks to this directly. But honestly, the things that we're really told regularly to eat, spinach, almonds and other nuts, Swiss chard, beets, dark chocolate. Heaven help everybody out there like me who loves chocolate. That's a really bad one. And some of the new superfoods, like people are talking about chia seeds, chaga mushroom, those are really eye-wateringly high. There's some research that shows that chaga mushroom could be as high as up to 20,000 milligrams in 100 grams. So basically a fifth of that mushroom would be toxic oxalate, which is sort of crazy. I'm surprised we even call it food. Other big guys would be some of the exotic things that foodies go after: kiwi fruit, plantain, star fruit. So there are some, really notable things that, particularly nuts, that people are eating in abundance. And just an ounce of almonds is about 400 milligrams of oxalate. Like, that's a lot.
Well, yeah. Okay. So 400 is a lot. What is a typical daily amount that wouldn't be problematic for people? Is there, I don't think there's an RDA for oxalates. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there's not.
No real RDA. There's a couple of associations out there that deal with oxalate, but one of the ones that's been a bit nuanced has been the Vulvar Pain Foundation, where they found that oxalate was linked to women struggling with vulvodynia. And what they define it as, and what I stick with, is a low intake would be 40 to 60 milligrams. So 1/10 of what's in your almonds. A medium intake would be 61 milligrams to 100. And most of the people I work with, if they're eating like an omnivore, will be in that range. And then essentially anything over 100 milligrams intake a day would be high, but it's not reflective at all of what people are taking in, because I myself was probably eating 1,500, maybe more milligrams of oxalate every day. And I've had clients who were at, unbelievable amounts, doing a paleo diet, doing this everything right approach, and eating like 3,000 milligrams of oxalate a day.
Yeah, so diagnostically, it's a bit of a challenge, or my understanding is a bit of a challenge. There's not any real specific markers, serum markers, urine markers are unreliable. It's basically based on symptoms, and the symptoms can be quite, all over the place. There's a lot of things that could do it. So it's kind of like, how do you sort it out for something else? So how do you sort out oxalate issues versus anything else that can mimic their symptoms? Is there a reliable way to do that?
The tough thing with this is that, as you rightly point out, we're not really testing for it in a way that has good, reliable diagnostic criteria. Essentially, when people are getting blood tests for oxalate, they're already in renal failure. So we're not tracking what kind of the normal amount of oxalate would be in the bloodstream, and what's in the urine can vary because of what the kidneys are doing in order to get it out. So honestly, the best way to know if oxalates is your problem is to lower oxalates and see if something happens. And that's unfortunate, because that's not the way most people want to do anything. But if you lower oxalate and that's the only thing you're lowering, and you see positive changes, or even if you see negative changes, because you can actually trigger oxalate to move out of the tissues by lowering. But if that's the only lever that you pulled, it's kind of the best way we have to say, yeah, this is probably oxalate, versus, no, you've got some other kind of problem. We've taken oxalate down and you show no signs of anything changing.
Are there some classic symptoms that you would look for? Obviously, there could be a wide variety of presentation, but other things that you say, that is most likely an oxalate issue if somebody comes to you presenting with the following symptoms?
Yeah. The biggest ones would be kind of the obvious ones. If you've got anything going on along the urinary tract where you've got either intermittent significant inflammation or pretty constant inflammation, I would absolutely be looking for oxalate. The challenge is that even if you're not getting kidney stones, you could have like microcrystals in the urine. And so anywhere along the urinary tract could be irritated.
So could that mimic UTIs? Because a lot of women have recurrent UTIs and they're constantly on antibiotics. Could that play somewhere into that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done some work with a practitioner who specializes in interstitial cystitis, and essentially she now treats everybody as if they've got an oxalate problem, whether it's obvious or not. As soon as they've got that consistent inflammation, she takes down their oxalate intake.
And so, and you pointed out, and as you probably know, I've been an advocate of a carnivorous diet. I have a lot of people, incidentally lower their oxalates, just by going carnivore. Obviously, there's no oxalate in that diet. And many of them receive tremendous improvements in their health. And then you hear a certain percentage of them say, well, maybe I'm having oxalate dumping. And it's hard to know for sure. So how do you figure that out in someone who has reduced oxalates from their diet, and maybe some of their symptoms, whether the GI or pain or fatigue or gut issues or whatever it might be? How do you sort that out?
Yeah, it's a bit nuanced when you don't have diagnostic tests, obviously, to back you up. But the GI is actually ground zero. if the oxalate problem is really related to their diet and they've been eating a very high oxalate diet, then those are the tissues that would have been first exposed to oxalate and are most likely to have some level of inflammation and compromise. So if I've got somebody who's got GI issues, then I'm going to work with them so that their oxalate's coming down, but slowly. This is the sort of the hiccup with carnivore. I'm also a carnivore. I found over time that lowering my oxalate was a game changer, but that really getting healthy took me to the carnivore diet. And I'm very happy like that. And in fact, as I was saying as we came on, healthier than I've been in decades. But the thing is, for people who go straight to carnivore, some people are going to do fine. And some people going straight to carnivore are going to get their butt kicked. And the ones who are getting their butt kicked, I would say, just based on my experience with working with people who are lowering oxalate, probably have more oxalate stored, have probably been extra healthy eaters for a very long time. Like somebody who's been a vegan or a vegetarian for a decade or longer, when they go to a carnivore diet, they probably need to kind of ease into it in order to manage the symptoms better. One of the odd things about oxalate is that if your system is getting rid of oxalate out of the tissues and it's doing that too aggressively, introducing some oxalate into the digestive tract, kind of using the hair of the dog, it's a bit of the poison that's causing your problem. But it seems to signal to the tissues, slow down. You can't dump this much into the bloodstream because we've got something coming down the pipe in the digestive tract and we're going to have to deal with that. So there are some tools like that that people can use, but it can be a very nuanced dance between needing to support their mitochondria because oxalate turns out to be a mitochondrial toxin, trying to help them get their inflammation down, and at the same time trying to reduce this substance, which is probably the original problem maker, but at the same time, it's a little like heavy metal detox. You don't want it to come out too fast either. It's as toxic going in as it is going out. And when it's leaving, it's getting that one more kick at the can. So you kind of want to moderate how fast it leaves. A little like the problem with heavy metals. If you take heavy metals out of people too quickly, you're going to make them sicker. And so I'm usually trying to work with people so that they can get through getting rid of some of this toxic load without being as sick as some of them can get.
So given that you said that these things tend to accumulate first in the gut because that's the first interface that food comes in contact with, and many people on carnivore, not all, but many certainly have GI issues, which could be related to fat malabsorption and gut microbiome shifts and, minerals and electrolytes. Do you think oxalates could have a role in something like this? People that have, kind of chronic diarrhea, would that be a symptom potentially of that?
I do think so. What I find with all my clients is that nobody's sort of happily pooping, if you will. They either have constipation or they have diarrhea. So I think it's how the gut is handling that inflammation. But when it comes to digestion overall, part of the issue is that certain parts of the digestive tract are going to be more susceptible because of some of the nutrients they need. And what I'd say there is the liver is needing a lot of things like sulfate in order to do detox, and it's going to be producing your bile for you so that you can digest your fats well. And because the liver is trying to uptake sulfate, but those cell transporters that move sulfate also move oxalate, sometimes the liver is actually one of the indicators that you've got an oxalate problem because you start to have this problem with digesting fat. And in fact, gallstones can be oxalate based. And so we can actually have the liver not functioning as well as it should. And without enough bile, you're also not going to have a proper bowel elimination. And similarly with digestion of food, the pancreas takes up bicarbonate because it's going to raise the pH level of the chyme as it leaves the stomach into the intestines so that it's at the right pH level. And those cell transporters that move bicarbonate can also move oxalate. And so you can have compromise of both digestive enzymes and pH regulation in the gut, as well as a problem with bile. So it's like oxalate's just uniquely positioned with how our digestion functions to really be messing us up.
So I think, correct me if they're wrong, there are certain supplements you can take that can make this problem worse, and there are some that may potentially be beneficial. Could you maybe outline some of those?
Yeah, I'd love to. So ironically, some of the things that can make you feel worse are actually things you need. So some of this is a little bit of a getting the right dose. Things that, though, can really make the problem worse, just right ahead, directly worse, can be things like vitamin C, which degrades into oxalate. So we're actually adding to the oxalate load. The other kinds of things that can make things worse would be supplements that are high in oxalate themselves. So herbal things, think herbal things that are not an extract or a tincture. So if somebody's taking something like a whole plant-based, like milk thistle seed or something like that to try and get the benefits of milk thistle, they're actually adding oxalate to the system while they're taking that supplement. And then the third class of things that could be a problem would be amino acids that are more likely to be metabolized into oxalate so that you're increasing the oxalate that's coming through the metabolism. And those, the key ones that I've learned about are glycine and collagen and gelatin. That doesn't mean you can't have any of them, but big concentrated doses of these things, especially if they're going into your system without the cofactors to avoid the production of oxalate, could be a problem.
And then I think I can remember potassium citrate being something that might be beneficial. Is that correct, or am I wrong on that?
No, you're correct. The thing about citrates is it helps with pH levels, and potassium citrate's one of the things that's conventionally prescribed to reduce the risk of kidney stones. So if you can keep your potassium levels up, if you can keep your magnesium levels up, both of those are known to reduce the risk of kidney stones. But they also help with oxalate in general because oxalate's a mineral chelator. And so it wants to bind to a mineral essentially in order to balance out the charge because it's a double negative anion. So if you can provide more of the minerals that actually are going to bind with it, but keep it more soluble, then actually that's an advantage. So potassium citrate, you get the citrate disassociating from the potassium. If oxalate binds with potassium, it's completely soluble. It's easy for the kidneys to get rid of. Magnesium oxalate is also easier for the kidneys to get rid of. And of course, if oxalate binds with calcium, iron, some of these other things, then you're going to be more likely to have something that precipitates out as stones. And it might not be in the kidneys, could be in the joints, like it could be happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 80% of kidney stones are calcium oxalate stones. I mean, it's
Yeah.
something that
Yeah,
most
about
people don't
80%.
realize. Yeah. And do you find that this is one of those situations where I sometimes will see that someone will go on a low oxalate, often a carnivore diet, and sometimes they'll develop a kidney stone, which I suspect was previously there, and it's just now going into solution. Maybe it's maybe they had a staghorn type kidney stone where the whole kidney renal medulla was filled with stone, and now they're breaking up and dissociating. Is that thinking correctly? Do you see that?
Yeah, I think you can have actually two things. You can have the big stone that's coming into pieces and then it starts to move. You can also have that the body's now able to move a lot more oxalate out of the tissues. And so you're getting more oxalate into the urine. And so now you're actually getting enough in the urine that it's precipitating out. So you can have kind of both ends of that. Again, another reason why you might want to moderate how fast oxalate's leaving the body so that you don't end up creating a stone when that's what you were trying to avoid.
So what, because I mean, obviously if you're on a carnivore diet, outside of oxalate dumping, you're not going to be exposed to much oxalate. But if you're on an omnivorous diet, low carb diet, ketogenic diet, or whatever, Mediterranean, vegan diet, whatever you want to do, what are the big foods that are going to be most likely to have the most oxalates that you're going to be exposed to? I mean, you mentioned some of those, Swiss chard is, I don't know how often that's eaten by most people. It's kind of one of those specialty vegetables, but what are the things that are like everyday common foods that we would be exposed to?
The biggest everyday common ones could be some of the spices. So turmeric's got a lot of spice, a lot of oxalate.
That's a super spice, right? With the curcumin, and everybody's raving about the.
Everybody's raving about it. I
Right.
see these people with golden milk recipes and they're adding all these high oxalate things to it. And I just cringe. The thing about turmeric is that what's good for you is the curcumin. So if you can get the curcumin as, an isolated component, so you've got an extract or you've got a curcumin supplement, then you're fine. But if you've got whole turmeric and you're dumping it in a cup, please don't do that. Regular other ordinary things that people could have that's giving them a lot of oxalate would definitely be chocolate. A lot of people are eating a lot of chocolate. A lot of people are eating a lot of potatoes, or sweet potatoes is the new rage as a French fry at a restaurant. Those are both going to be high. People who are trying to be extra healthy and are eating things like chia pudding in order to make sure they're getting their fiber, they're consuming a ton of oxalate with that. Because you're right, Swiss chard's not your basic one, but it's probably more those kinds of things like potatoes and sweet potatoes for somebody who's just a regular omnivore. Some of the spices
Coffees
and
and teas, correct me. I think some of the coffees and teas might have some, correct? Or no?
coffee has a little, but
Okay.
coffee's not. I don't think anybody's developing an oxalate problem from that unless they're getting dehydrated and they have a tendency to kidney stones. But tea can have a fair bit, but it's almost an incidental player against some of these other higher ones. The thing about tea is if you drink a lot of it, then you could be getting a fair bit of oxalate from it. And people do eat a lot of potatoes, so that's a big one. People do love their legumes. So, those pinto beans and refried beans and things like that, that could be a source of oxalate for people as well. So some of those kinds of things I'd be more worried about maybe than the kind of specialty things that not everybody's coming in contact with.
Now, I mean, oxalates are, in the scientific literature, I think oxalates are well known with their impact on kidney, and there's papers on acute renal failure from somebody eating spinach smoothies in excess and things like that. And it sounds like there's some level of understanding around cystitis, vulvodynia, things like that. Are there any areas of research that have really focused on oxalate and other major issues? I think Sally mentioned that cardiovascular atherosclerotic disease sometimes has oxalate associated with it. There's joint issues, but what are the other major things that oxalates tend to drive?
It's really inflammatory conditions, and it's really across so many different tissue types. But there is a link actually between oxalate and cystic fibrosis, which is interesting. It's well known in the cystic fibrosis world. And there's new information coming out about oxalate and some neurological things like Parkinson's and dementia. So the research is starting to develop now where people are looking for where oxalate ends up. The problem with our current approach has been we only look for it when it's involved with the kidneys, but if we're not looking anywhere else in the body, I think that's where we're at risk. Oh, but one of the things actually that's really interesting is that oxalate can get deposited in the eyes. And so one of the really interesting symptoms that some people have once they drop their oxalate is eye irritation, like crystals around the edge of the eyes, not like sleep, but really hard ones. And we've had some reports through the Trying Low Oxalate support group, which is now on Facebook, of people who have gotten cuts on their cornea with nothing evident in their eyes. And we're very suspicious about oxalate dumping because the hyperoxaluria literature shows that oxalate can be being deposited in the eyes. And so we're seeing it in people who have secondary hyperoxaluria from diet, and it's actually happening.
Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Do you know if, obviously if someone goes to their urologist or nephrologist and they have, oxalate-based kidney stones, is there a consensus recommendation on low oxalate diets in that situation, or are they still kind of oblivious to this?
It's kind of all over the place. Like some organizations are recommending lowering oxalate, but the levels at which they recommend you lower to vary greatly. And I've had clients who have said that their nephrologist told them they should lower oxalate. And I've had other clients who have said their nephrologist said not to worry about it and take calcium or drink milk when they had a high oxalate source. So I'm not sure exactly how to express this, but it's almost like there's varying levels of seriousness with which the whole idea of oxalate as a possible problem is taken. And the research is really, I don't think that the kinds of information that's in the research is making it out to frontline medical doctors the way one might hope it would.
The recommendation to combine oxalate foods with milk, I assume you're hoping that the calcium will bind with the oxalate and will precipitate out and won't be absorbed to the gut. Is that the theory behind that?
That's exactly the theory. There's actually research which has shown that actually works really well. So if you're either taking a calcium or even a CalMag or a multi-mineral supplement at the same time as you're taking in a higher oxalate source, that can help you then bind it in the gut and then excrete it with the stool. It's not an all or nothing kind of thing because you still can absorb some of it, says the research, but you're going to avoid a much larger component of what you would otherwise be absorbing into the system.
Yeah. So if you had a spinach salad and you topped it with, I can't imagine you pouring milk on it, but maybe a bunch of cheese or something like that, which wouldn't be that uncommon. That might mitigate it somewhat, I suppose.
A little bit, but spinach is so high and there's a certain concentration issue. So the higher the concentration in the gut, the more likely you're going to move into the bloodstream. So yeah, some of these things work, but it's not perfectly. And people will talk about gut bacteria as well. But the challenge there is really we can exceed the capacity of our gut bacteria to help us by using some of this because they see oxalate as a fuel, which is great. So they use it and they break it down and then we don't absorb it. Even with the best intact microbiome, if you're taking in 3,000 milligrams of oxalate a day, I suspect you're exceeding the capacity of those bacteria.
So you had mentioned, 17 years ago, you got into this sort of oxalate business and, removing it improved your health significantly. Carnivore helped out a little bit more. What is the typical time frame for someone who does have an oxalate issue? I'm sure there's some individual variation there, but is there like minimum time that you can expect? Like if somebody says, "Hey, I'm going to try this low oxalate," like if somebody says they want to go on a carnivore, I say, "Hey, go do it for 3 months." That'll give you an idea if it's going to be beneficial to you or not. Is there something similar with low oxalate diets that you might recommend?
Yeah, probably. What I would say is for a lot of people, when they lower their oxalate substantially, they're probably going to get what we would call a honeymoon period where they feel a lot better. And then when oxalate starts to move out of the system, they may get an exacerbation of their symptoms. They may either feel as bad as they did when they started the diet or at least have some degree of symptoms as oxalate's leaving. And that'll depend a lot on how fragile their health is or how much health compromise they already have. So probably in the first month, you feel pretty good, then you feel pretty bad. Probably by, like, if you're in pretty good shape, I was 48 when I hit this and I was not in good shape. But in about 6 months, I was substantially better. And even in the first month, even after oxalate dumping started, I could feel that something was different because I'd been the kind of person who had to take handfuls of digestive enzymes to get a meal down because nothing was functioning the way it was supposed to. And my digestion started to improve really quickly. So I went, this thing is working. So it's not like you would have no improvement at all, but you might have a few kind of rocky months to be able to get through. And then at that point, you start to get breaks in this movement of oxalate out of the system because in the first few months, it can be pretty constant. But I was essentially by about 18 months out feeling like a normal me.
When people are either, I guess, transitioning away from a higher oxalate diet, you might recommend let's taper this off slowly so we don't precipitate a big, you know, movement of the oxalate that's already stored in the body, perhaps. And then if someone is, let's say they go zero carb carnivore, and then they start experience what you think is clearly an oxalate issue. How do you, I mean, what sources would you recommend to reintroduce or one, I would talk about how to transition away from oxalates to no oxalates. And then if somebody does have a dumping episode, how do you deal with that?
Right. Yeah, I would generally recommend going slower. So I know that in the carnivore community, there are a lot of us who have gone straight to carnivore and it's worked well. And I think that's great. But if your health is really fragile, then I would say go towards carnivore, but keep some oxalate sources in your diet. And normally I would recommend things which are also lower histamine. That's another whole ball game in terms of what oxalate can be doing. But some people can start to have histamine related issues. So if they're going to keep oxalate in their diet, I tend to recommend lower histamine items that they would keep in their diet. So the aforementioned earlier in the conversation, turmeric, as bad as it is in oxalate, that could be a source that somebody keeps in their diet because it's lower histamine and it gives them enough oxalate punch, if you will, to signal the body that it can't just let everything, all of these big sources of oxalate in the body to be moved right away. So I would have people have a certain amount of oxalate per day and then maybe have some what I would call rescue foods, high oxalate, but low in histamine. So we're not stressing anything in the body that might be used if you feel really particularly bad. Oxalate dumping's really awful. And then you might use a higher amount of oxalate to kind of push back at this release from the tissues. And so typically I would try to ease people in and then try to keep them able to get the benefits, even if it's not fully carnivore, of at least going much lower carb because ketones are anti-inflammatory too. So if you can keep them in a range where they're still going to be able to get some of the benefits of that kind of eating, while maintaining some oxalate just to slow down how fast the body starts moving the stuff out. That's kind of the dance. And that's a little bit nuanced between how much you might need, because that might depend on how much of an oxalate toxicity issue you have. But I would probably look at spices. I would probably look at some of the low carb vegetables that are lower histamine but have some oxalate to them so you can push back.
So that's a transition. Now, if somebody is, 3 months have been in a carnivore diet and all of a sudden maybe they get symptoms of oxalate dumping, which is, maybe they've ruled everything out. Would that make sense to say, hey, try some potassium citrate? Does that maybe has a benefit, or before you add these other foods in, or how would you sort of navigate that?
I would have them do the experiment of having some higher oxalate something to see whether or not they get any benefit from it. Sometimes the body is already committed to moving the oxalate out and it's not going to play. And that I've had the odd person where that was true. But then I would probably look at supplements to be able to support their system to handle the amount of work that this pro-oxidant free radical mineral chelator, blah, blah, blah is doing to their system. So potassium citrate might be one part of it, but it's probably going to include magnesium. It would probably include, maybe some targeted amino acids where you might be getting a fair bit from your diet, but the demand in your body might be beyond what you're getting in the diet because you really have to support the mitochondria. This is one of those things where your mitochondria are being just kicked around the block. Might be some B vitamins, because even though, again, the carnivore diet is very replete in them, I don't take really any B vitamins per se anymore, but every person can be a bit different there in terms of how much they'd need. And the big guns for people dealing with oxalate toxicity is really B1, biotin, and B6. So I might have someone do some experiments with that to see if those are helpful. And Epsom salts baths, like really simple things, can be really helpful here. Even adding like baking soda, so sodium bicarbonate, to the Epsom salt in your bath, you're actually getting 4 nutrients there. You're getting some sodium for your electrolytes, because all of us who are really low carb are probably needing that at the beginning. You're getting the bicarbonate, which your pancreas needs, but it's also a pH resource. You're getting the magnesium, you're getting some sulfate, and it does really seem to make a difference. But some of this will depend very much on where your body is compromised and what nutrients it actually needs to deal with the stuff.
The last time I think I interviewed Sally Norton was a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I think I saw her this summer as part of a movie that I think we're both in. But
right,
she was decrying the fact that the literature has been very sparse. There's nobody that really wants to research it. Has that changed at all? Has there been a few more studies that have been done, or more people, researchers opening to studying this a little bit more?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a scientist, Dr. Aaron Miller, who has been doing a fair bit of research in this area. And he's one of the guys who's coming out with information on how oxalate is impacting the cardiovascular system. Oxalate as a trigger to breast cancer, that research is actually a number of years old. So I've been trying to pay attention to what's new in the field. And there does seem to be a lot more going on now, which is speaking a lot more to where does oxalate impact us, like looking at oxalate and NRF2 and looking at different metabolic pathways and how it stimulates inflammation. And there's some a little bit older research on joints and how if you've got an arthritis where it's not lining up with a profile properly, it sort of varies from time to time, that where you've got that kind of variability, which doesn't seem to be related to a clear trigger, that you look for oxalate. So there's more things that are starting to be done. I think it's just getting it out in front of the people who are treating patients and dealing with individuals who might have a problem.
You'd mentioned an impact on cardiovascular disease. Maybe you could talk a little bit of how you understand that oxalates may have an impact on cardiovascular disease.
It looks like they're involved in arterial plaque, which is, that we know how risky arterial plaque is. That would be a big deal. Like if we can reduce arterial plaque by reducing oxalate in the diet, that's pretty amazing.
Okay, interesting on that. I'm trying to think, what else is of interest in the oxalate world, or anything else you do that would be relevant here?
Oh dear, that's a big question. I think the biggest thing that would be really relevant for people to be thinking about with their diet in particular is that what we really want is a nutrient-dense diet that's low in toxin. Carnivore absolutely fits that bill. But for those who are, perhaps not interested in carnivore, you can be an omnivore where what you're doing is trying to make your diet nutrient-dense and low in toxin. And, from my standpoint, that's the kind of thing which is really making a difference in people's lives. And then from the standpoint of where my interests are at the moment, if you will, because I'm kind of always following my nose based on what my clients are dealing with. There is what I lovingly refer to as the three-ring circus of oxalate, histamine, and salicylate. That's like a huge topic in and of itself. But it looks like oxalate does things that set us up for histamine problems, mostly because of the kind of inflammation it can be setting up in the whole body, how the immune system reacts to that, and how the immune system starts to become more and more reactive because it's got all this inflammation in the body. And there could be a relationship here with mast cell activation, which I know is on the radar for some people. And then also there's this direct correlation between how well the liver functions and whether or not we develop salicylate intolerance. And that's another thing that I see a lot among my clients is that they can no longer detox as well as they could before. And so there's another whole piece of, function that oxalate's affecting there. And these are all dominoes that drop after somebody pushes over the oxalate domino. At least they get hooked on it because it tastes good. But the problem is there's actually an astonishing amount of oxalate in that. Now, there is a way for people to cheat. So I don't want to be just a total killjoy. So I will say this. Every once in a while, my husband and I will go out for a little date. We'll go to this local chocolatier. They make their own little truffles. I will pick one exquisite piece of chocolate, but probably something that doesn't have a chocolate center. And I will have it with calcium magnesium supplement at the same time so that I'll bind some of the chocolate or some of the oxalate that's in the chocolate. And I'll just let myself off leash every once in a while. But I do that in a very measured kind of way. Like it better be a special occasion and it better be chocolate that's worth it because otherwise I'm happily eating as a carnivore. So it's not like I must do that, but when people are eating it every day because, it's really good for you and it supports your brain health and these kinds of things, I just cringe because it's really not doing those things over the long term. So short term, when they do short term research, they may not be picking up on the problem that develops over the long term. And what I see in my clients is the people who are developing the long term problem.
Yeah, I think this is a lot of the problem with some of these scientific discoveries. And they'll say, oh, this is involved in this pathway and we think this is beneficial. And that's the end of the story. And there's no chronic, what's going on? It's a chronic adaptation. What's the chronic outcome with some of the other compounds? And so then, people sell either their supplement or their chocolate bar and I could see people, listening to you say, well, I'm just going to load up on magnesium, calcium supplements and just, binge on chocolate, and eat bottles of this supplement. So I could see where someone might try to do that because it is it can be very addictive for a lot of people.
Yep.
Let's talk about your social media a little bit. You've got, I think you're on Twitter or X now, I guess. Where do you relay some of this information there? Do you have a website or something like that, I guess?
Oh, I have unfortunately a bunch of social media handles like most of us do nowadays. So I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on, heaven help me, TikTok.
Yeah.
I'm on Facebook. So you can find me as Low Ox Coach at most locations, but I somehow have an orphan account on X. So I'm actually Low Ox Coach 1 now, as opposed to Low Ox Coach there.
Somebody might have beat you to it. I don't know.
No, it was me who beat me to it. I have an orphan account. I can't seem to figure out how to get them to give it back to me. So.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So Low Ox Coach, Low Oxalate or Low Ox?
Just low ox. Actually,
Low Ox Coach.
Somebody asked me if I was lowering oxen in people's diets.
Well, I guess you could do that. I'm kind of a I'm trying to raise oxen content in people's diets. So anything. So up there in Canada, which is not too far away from us, is there any kind of, I think the dietary guidelines are pushing towards probably a high oxalate diet. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, pretty much across North America, it's pretty much the same. Like we might have slightly different words. They might have slightly different graphics, but I think it's all the same recommendations.
Yeah, this kind of overwhelmingly grain plant-based diet with a smidgen of meat so you don't totally starve to death, and low fat, all that sort of stuff. So removing oxalate from your diet in your sort of your 50s, carnivore in your 60s, best health you've been in probably many decades. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, interestingly enough, in the fall, I had to have a completely unrelated surgery. And I was out of commission for about 2, 3 months before I got back to my trainer. And she was quite surprised. And I was quite surprised too, because I still have muscle, even though I
You got some
wasn't
gun,
working
yeah.
out. Right. So, if anything, what I love about carnivore is that it would appear to me that this problem with losing muscle mass over age might be related to the fact that our protein intake's just not what it should be.
Yeah.
I don't eat a little bit of protein. I eat a lot of protein, and I'm like thriving that way. And in fact, healed up from my surgery so fast that even my surgeon thought I was a bit of a rock star when it came to doing that. So I honestly think that we really do need to be more animal based, whether you're 100% animal based or not, because I think the protein requirements have been set to avoid disease, not optimize health.
Yeah, I think so. I also think some of that has to do with just commodity marketing and some of that stuff. They all these grain, they all got all this grain they want to sell, and it's like, what are we going to do with all this stuff we grow? Well, I'll tell you what, very fascinating, Monique. Appreciate this. Low Ox Coach on all the social media sites except Twitter. Low Ox Coach #1. So I'll give you the last word. Anything else you want to say before we go?
Sure. I actually have a Patreon group. So if people want to learn more and they want to have, like, I go into the research, I go into how to eat, I show them what our plates look like sometimes. I give them a bunch of ideas. So, yeah, things like menu plans and so on as well. And I do a monthly Zoom on there. So if they want to look me up as Low Ox Coach on patreon.com, they can come and join the fun. And I do have a website, and it's lowoxcoach.com. So they can also find me there. Although it's being ignored a lot lately. So I seem to be spending time in other places, but they can find me in all those places. And yeah, happy to help people understand a little bit more about either why they're not thriving on carnivore when they should, especially if they're new carnivores, or how to eat an omnivore diet that's nutrient dense and low in toxins.